back to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, I talked about some of the individuals and groups who were involved in coordinating various protest activities around the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago in August of 1968. In this lecture, we'll talk about the convention itself and the various activities and protests that happened outside, and how the plans made by those various groups and individuals actually played out on the ground. After their successful protests in New York City, and having learned from their various experiences, the protesters hoped for a successful, peaceful, and effective week of protests in Chicago. However, Chicago was not New York, and they encountered a different response in Chicago, spearheaded by the mayor, Richard Daley. Daley was determined to maintain control in his city, and he announced, "Law and order will be maintained." Daley assembled a massive security force to maintain order in Chicago. Chicago police officers were armed with guns, billy clubs, helmets, and mace. They also deployed heavy weapons, shields, and cars, trucks, and jeeps with extensive protective material. The police spent months in training for riot control and techniques. During the convention, the police were put on 12-hour shifts rather than 8-hour shifts, meaning that at any given time, there were 50% more officers on duty than usual. It also meant a police force working long, tense shifts, pushing beyond their normal limits. As the week went on, police troops confronted not only the growing crowds of chanting protesters, but their own weariness, exhaustion, and impatience. Conditions were ripe for violence. Chicago authorities were given an unanticipated trial run of their crowd control techniques after the April 4th assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. In Chicago, as in many other cities, the assassination was met with massive protests and marching in the streets. While Daley attempted to calm the crowds by speaking in positive terms about King and his methods, when in fact the two had been bitter enemies, enraged crowds still took to the streets. In an effort to maintain order, Daley controversially issued a shoot-to-kill order, authorizing police to shoot to kill or maim suspected looters in the streets. As the two sides squared off, protesters threw rocks and bottles at the police, who attempted to maintain order. Over the following weeks, and in particular, on a massive march on April 27th known as the Peace March, as protesters organized their marches, Chicago police at times harassed the marchers, beating them with billy clubs, taunting them, and arresting anyone who stepped out of carefully hashed-out protest lines. Thus, a pattern was established of protests carrying on, while Chicago authorities were given carte blanche to harass, beat, and arrest them by Daley's shoot-to-kill message. When the Democratic National Convention arrived in August, along with the extensive protests being planned by the Yippies, Moab, and others, it was a recipe for disaster. One method employed by Daley and Chicago authorities was to deny the issuance of permits to protesters to march, gather, or camp out in public parks and other areas. Typically, cities are fairly lenient in authorizing groups to march or protest, as it is a First Amendment right in this country to peacefully assemble. But Daley and other government officials hoped to limit the number of protesters in the city, so they delayed or denied the permit requests. And indeed, many protesters did not come to Chicago because permits hadn't been granted, and they feared the response of the Chicago police. Moab and other leaders hoped to conduct their protests legally and submitted many requests for permits. They were denied by the city, however, and Daley and his officers responded with counter-proposals that would have greatly limited the size of the protests and kept them to very limited areas. They were not authorized to gather in any of the city's parks, for instance. The week of the convention got started on an ominous note. The day before the conventioneers and protesters started to arrive in Chicago, a 17-year-old boy named Dean Johnson was killed by the police after being stopped for a curfew violation early on the morning of August 22nd. Johnson reportedly had drawn a weapon against the officers. As protesters arrived in the city the next day, Johnson's name was on everyone's lips, and the tone had been set for police violence. Johnson became the only death in the city directly tied to Convention Week. But because his shooting took place before the bulk of visitors had arrived, it didn't spark a massive direct protest as it might have done a few days later. The protest of the Democratic National Convention began on Friday, August 23rd, with Jerry Rubin and the Yippies formally nominating a pig named Pegasus as the Yippie candidate for president. Not long after arriving at the Civic Center with the pig, Rubin and several other protesters were arrested. The media dove into the story. Many people gave interviews, and the protests had kicked off with this attention-grabbing display. The next morning, the larger planned events were scheduled to begin. Protest leaders were dismayed at the relatively small number of protesters to arrive. Again, thanks largely to the lack of permits and the prospect of police violence. Protesters gathered at Lincoln Park, but they agreed not to stay long since the permits had not been issued, and they seemed to be inviting mass arrest. Instead, they took to the streets, chanting and marching from the park to the convention hall. That Saturday night, police were able to disperse the crowd with a minimum of violence, cutting off the marchers at various intersections and using police cars to block the streets and push protesters back. A dozen or so protesters were arrested that night, but most left the scene before any violence broke out. The situation grew decidedly more tense on Sunday, when the Yippies finally were allowed to hold a gathering in Lincoln Park, known as the Festival of Life, featuring the politically radical band MC5, the only band who showed up for the concert. Despite having a permit for the gathering, the atmosphere between police, protesters, and event organizers remained tense. The police refused to allow the organizers to bring a flatbed truck into the park, which they were hoping to use as a stage for the band's performance. They also limited access to electricity, which was essential to the sound system and musical equipment. The crowd seemed ready for a confrontation, and Abbie Hoffman gave speeches to the crowd in dispersal tactics and how to avoid arrest and capture. Police gathered around the protesters, at times pushing and harassing them, looking for excuses to clamp down. Finally, at about 9:00 p.m., as darkness had set in, an outright clash between the police and the protesters broke out. The two sides had lined up and been face to face for hours, pushing and taunting each other. As police attempted to block access to the park bathrooms, protesters flocked to the scene, yelling and heckling the police. Finally, the police charged the crowd, swinging their billy clubs, and protesters scattered. This scene was replicated several different times at different locations in the park, and in the dark, rumors swirled about what was happening in other parts of the park. At the 11 p.m. curfew hour, police forced the protesters out of the park, but many of them remained in the streets, continuing to march, chant, and taunt the police. Eventually, police decided to clear the streets as well as to keep the city running, and reinforcements arrived at the scene, charging the protesters, beating them, and arresting those they could get their hands on. The tone set on Sunday night carried forward throughout the convention. The convention hall itself looked like a war zone, surrounded by barbed wire and checkpoints to allow access for the conventioneers. But the hall floor was not immune from violence. Television reporters like Mike Wallace and Dan Rather were roughed up by security officials in the arena. Another famous confrontation at the convention involved Mayor Daley and one of the speakers, Senator Abraham Ribicoff. During his speech nominating George McGovern for president, Ribicoff said that under McGovern, we, quote, would not have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. An enraged Daley shook his fist and shouted expletives at Ribicoff, further degrading what was supposed to be a wholesome and positive event. All in all, the Democratic National Convention created both an awful visual for the country and an awful launch to the presidential campaign for the Democrats. While ensuing reports of the events determined that the violence was actually a, quote, police riot, and pointed the lion's share of the blame at Daley and his security forces, Americans watching the violence play out on television only had more reasons to listen to Richard Nixon and the Republicans, who were talking about law and order. The Republican convention had taken place a few weeks earlier in Miami, and while generally regarded as dull and uninteresting, it was also peaceful and quiet. Who and what caused the violence in Chicago was easily muddied by Republicans, who were able to draw a pointed contrast between their own peaceful convention and the violent and chaotic one held in Chicago. The legacy of those events was revived the following year when the trial of the Chicago 7 became a front-page story in its own right. The trial extended for nearly 6 months in late 1969 and into 1970, with the circus theatrics between Abbie Hoffman and Judge Julius Hoffman highlighting a trial that at times seemed to put the American system on trial as much as the pacifists who were being prosecuted. The seriousness of the proceedings was underscored by the treatment of Bobby Seale, who was prosecuted as an original member of the group known as the Chicago 8, but who had his own lawyer and who was also being prosecuted for other accusations from a separate incident. Seale so vehemently insisted on his rights to a fair trial that Judge Hoffman ordered him bound, gagged, and chained to a chair. So disturbing was this image to the jury that eventually Seale's trial was declared a mistrial, and he was then removed from the group. The story of the Chicago 7 has been told in books, songs, and films many times over the years, most recently in the 2020 Aaron Sorkin film, The Trial of the Chicago 7, on Netflix. I certainly invite and encourage everyone to review those other sources for more information about the trial. Since it is an aftershock of the events of 1968, though, I'll leave that discussion for another course. In the next lecture, we'll turn to the Republicans and their candidates and convention, and to the presidential election itself.